paranormal got to do with it? Although holistic and alternative healing methods are becoming more and more mainstream, what method is right for you? How do you find a practitioner once you've chosen to explore an alternative therapy? Each week, host Deidre Sanford will explore a different modality with practitioners who will explain their modality and the benefits they and their clients have received through their sessions. Deidre and her guests may also offer live readings during the show and answer any questions you may have. Now, your host of Self-Care, What's the Paranormal Got to Do with It? Deidre Sanford.
Good morning, Parafam. Happy Wednesday. Yep, it's 10 a.m. on October the 26th, and you're watching Self-Care, What's Paranormal Got to Do with It on WLTK-DB. What's going on? We're getting closer and closer to Halloween. It's always been one of my favorite holidays. Ranks right up there with Thanksgiving in my world. So I had to put on my trick-or-treat ghosty shirt. What's everybody doing to get ready for Halloween or La Dia de los Muertos? Kind of the same, but kind of not. I think some of the traditions have gotten, well, pretty far reduced to just, hey, it's the day we go knocking on people's doors and beg. I mean, ask for candy. So much more to it for so many of us, especially here on this paranormal platform, right? Looking at aspects of honoring ancestors and remembering what our roots are, who our ancestors were, and what they present to us. To us. So we're moving along. I can't believe October is almost over. It's crazy. Where did the year go? I don't understand how we got 10 months into the year. Couple of things that I would like to do with the show today. Good morning, everyone. Pop over, say hello, let me know you're in. This show does not happen without you. It is for you. It is about you, and you are absolutely invited to put your comments, thoughts, questions, concerns into the chat so that we can incorporate you into the show. And there's Tim. Good morning, Tim. So that's where I was headed next, is the next place that we are going with our show this morning is, I want to kind of circle back to the show that we did on October the 12th with Candace Erickson Perham. She is emotion code, body code practitioner. And she was kind enough to help us out. Tim, if you want to tell us some of your story here in the comments, that would be fantabulous, because I would love to take this opportunity to follow up with our two volunteers, Lynne and Tim, from the show on the 12th, and find out a little bit more about their experience working with Candace during the airtime, and then also how things kind of played out for them in the last couple of weeks following their mini clearings. We talked during that show, and I think we've talked also on other shows about when you sit down, whether it be long distance or in-person one-on-one, to work with an energy healer or a healer, oftentimes it takes a while for the energy shift to settle in your body and for you to start seeing and truly feeling the effects of the work that was done. Sometimes you can be aware as a client of shifts that are happening, but it takes a little bit for those energies to settle in. I know it's the same thing with pranic healing. When you go through changes on an energetic level or an internally systemic level, it takes a while sometimes for us to be conscious of those shifts. The same thing applies to, like I said, pranic healing, emotion code. It applies to the work that we do in root cause therapy with our clients, Reiki, and certainly emotion code is no exception. Even readings, you get information during a reading, whether it be a mediumship reading, a psychic reading, tarot card reading, and it kind of sometimes hits in your higher levels, and then it takes it a while to trickle down, or maybe that information just sits up there before it actually is ready to come to the forefront of your conscious choices, decisions, and daily workings. So it's always kind of fun to see how that happens. I know that Tim had sent me a message maybe last week to tell us, or to tell me, that he had, hey, Donnie, that as Candace was speaking and working with him last week, or 2 weeks ago, excuse me, he had an unfamiliar sensation in his foot. And then since that time, he's had less pain in his right foot. But he added that there's more to the story. He said, since my mini session with her, my pain has substantially been reduced. And that's such great news. Those of you who had turned in or who might want to run over and catch the replay of that show on Self-Care Show at podbean.com, you can get the audio only version of that show, and any of the shows. Multiple shows from here on WLTK-DB are also available on Podbean. There were a lot of questions that Candace was asking our clients, and she was also working with the pendulum to get yes, no answers. And she went through a check of column A and column B, and that's like part of the emotion code process that I don't personally understand. It's not something that I choose to work with at this time because my brain went, yeah, I don't get it. But I have a lot of respect and admiration for our practitioners who do easily, readily absorb that process and bring about these amazing results. As Tim said, since his mini session with her, the pain in his foot has been substantially reduced. And as we clear the emotional field, or the emotional snapshot in time that's sitting in our energy field, hey, April, that's sitting in our energy field from these adverse experiences, or as Mark Ehrlich says, causal moments, then we free up the flow of energy and we can release a lot of the physical result that is presenting as a discomfort, and, sometimes generally wreaking havoc in our physical form throughout our current daily lives, no matter how old that experience may be. April, it's great to have you here with us this week on the show. Thanks for coming in to see us. So our other volunteer on the 12th was, surprisingly enough, and not planned, my friend Lynne Staley, hello, I don't know where that came from, Lynne Staley, who was also our guest on the show this week. Lynne was my personal grief coach in around 2012. My mom passed away in 2010, and I began to not function very well in my own life. In fact, so much so, after I helped through hospice care and took care of family business, I tried to go back to work. But I had been so focused on mom's hospice care, taking care of mom, taking care of family obligations and family members, that I neglected to care for myself. Good morning, Sherry. And so I ran into a wall. And it was an invisible wall, smacked me right in the head, but I had no idea what it was. But I learned shortly after I went back to work that I just wasn't functioning. So I went back to see my doctor, who gave me a medical diagnosis of extreme grief reaction and sent me on FMLA, or family medical leave, for my own recovery. And in that time, I met Lynne. And almost 3 years after mom passed away, I was still unable to really speak about my mom, speak about my relationship with my mother without collapsing and turning in on myself and dissolving in tears. And a friend said, hey, I want to introduce you to my friend Lynne. And they did. Amazing process, amazing all around human being. And I got to tell you, one heck of a grief coach. Todd, let's bring Lynne into the show. And hey, good morning.
Hey.
That was quick. So we're kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit this morning. I know I was speaking a bit about my experience in working with you, but I'd like to ask if you would be nice enough to circle back to the 12th of October when we were working with Candace, and she did a little mini clearing for you with emotion code, body code. Can you share with us a little bit about what that was like and what your experience has been with your foot since then?
Absolutely. Yeah. Both of us had issues with our feet.
Yeah.
Mine was my left foot. I thought it was fascinating because I understand, certainly intellectually, this mind-body connection and how we store these things in our bodies, in our energy. So I was very open and curious to see what might happen. She helped me identify what emotions might be involved in this pain in my foot. Also, really narrowing down a time frame when, something might have happened, that causal experience that you referred to.
Yeah.
And so I just thought it was fascinating. And I was certainly open to this mini session. And I too have had reduced discomfort in my foot. And it really opens me up to, let Candace know I'm gonna be in touch with her, because I think it's maybe speeds things up. And you don't have to be the one that identifies the timing and the issue.
Yes.
She helps with that, that connection to energy to really zero in on something. So I'm fascinated by it. And I think it's just really the way we need to be headed in terms of regaining a sense of well-being.
Mm-hmm. And returning to a sense of well-being, or even partially moving back into that space, is really what all of these modalities are about. And the reason this show exists, self-care. If we don't take time to take care of ourselves, as in the grief story that I was telling when my mom passed away, I didn't tend to my own needs. I didn't work with, acknowledge a lot of my own emotional experience in her passing. And my life kind of came to a screeching halt. But that's also part of why you're here with us today. Thank you for coming on the show. It was such a fun surprise to have you volunteer a couple of weeks ago to work with Candace. I need to be real open with everybody, because you know what? I've promised that this show is a safe space. It's a good place to be vulnerable. And if I'm not sharing with you guys, then how am I backing up that statement? So I've already mentioned that I worked with Lynne several years ago. Interestingly enough, and Lynne was scheduled to come on the show much later, a few weeks from now. And we were going to talk about heading into the holidays and how do we work through holidays with missing family members or family members who are no longer with us. And that was going to be a super focused conversation on dealing with death and how we move forward following a death experience. Not our death, of course, the death of a loved one. So I suddenly had an opening for the show on today, October the 26th. The scheduled guest was a very dear friend of mine who I've known for more years than I care to admit. He was also a fellow practitioner. He was a Jungian-based astrological intuitive, that is a mouthful, and had his own radio show quite a while ago, interviewing folks like Father Lawrence Black Elk, Wayne Dyer, just to mention a couple people that were on his show. Deepak Chopra was on the show as well. And he was going to come on today and talk about astrology and intuition, intuitive readings as self-care. But that brings us back to our topic today. Thomas passed away earlier this month. So it may seem a little self-serving, but I do want to dedicate the show to Thomas and his memory and the work that he had done for many, many, many years prior to his practicing. He was a known practitioner for over 40 years prior to his passing. So it's an honor to be able to bring him into our show today. And it's kind of perfect timing, not just the holidays, but personally for me to be able to talk about this topic with you. But I do want to add, leading into this subject, that we tend to think of grief as a focused response to a very specific experience, and that being the death of a loved one or a close one, someone that we knew in life. But that's really not true, is it, Lynne? It's not just focused on death and dying, or...
No, grief is the normal, natural, innate response to any disappointment and loss in life. And we often use the terms grief and mourning interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. Mourning is sharing our grief with others. Mourning is going public with our grief. Mourning is giving our grief the attention it deserves. And that's what we don't tend to do in our culture. So when people say, I never grieved my mom, or I never grieved this experience, I think they're really trying to say, I never mourned it. I never made sense of it. And so my job is to help people mourn, or to companion people in grief. I like that terminology better, to really link arms with people. And sometimes that means we start in a puddle. We just sit together in the sadness and in the tears.
Yeah, well, we certainly did.
But it's a hard place for people to, a hard door for people to walk through, because there are so many cultural and family messages, really unhealthy notions that continue to get promoted as the way out, or things that can really get in the way. We get the message that we shouldn't be sad.
Right.
Oh, he wouldn't want you to be sad. She's in a better place, those kinds of things. And even though it maybe isn't said so directly, that whole don't be sad, don't, it minimizes our experience.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's
then
something that our society does with emotions and emotional reactions to things across the board. Like even when we're toddlers, right? We're not supposed to have tantrums, but tantrums are just a signal that we little ones are having huge emotions that we haven't yet figured out how to process and how to work with. And we're taught from a very young age to shut it down.
It's communication. Absolutely. And then we also get the message that we should somehow replace the loss or fill the void. That is such a cultural message. Use your visa, go buy something to make yourself feel better. Or, if you've just ended a relationship, maybe to step into a new relationship too quickly, those kinds of things. You don't want to feel that emptiness. Find a way, we do it with food, that kind of thing. We get messages that we should be strong, be strong for others. And so then that ends up being the model that we show our children. And then we wonder why they aren't doing better than they are in terms of their expression of grief.
I think it's interesting because I really am quite certain that it wasn't until after getting through, if that's even an appropriate phrase, how about going through my own grief process, that I learned to be able to fully understand and acknowledge and be able to say to someone who was apologizing to me for crying and sharing emotions, I think it takes a stronger person to experience those emotions, to share them, to allow themselves to cry, than it does to bury all of that. Because really, in the long run, burying those emotions kind of makes us weak. And let me clarify that. Burying those emotions, swallowing them down, packing them down inside weakens our immune system, weakens our energy field. And it's really a denial of self. And in denying ourselves, isn't that the end result? Just kind of weakening ourselves across the board rather than letting ourselves shine and be our true selves. And in that aspect, finding our strength. Interesting thought.
Grief impacts us, not just in that emotional sense. I mean, that's maybe the aspect that is so clear to us.
Yes.
But grief impacts us cognitively, physically, emotionally, socially, spiritually, sometimes severely. And then there are consequences to the grief.
Yes.
So it's so complicated, and yet we always are searching for some kind of formula. And I think that gets in the way, because our grief is going to be as unique as the relationship or the circumstances in front of us. It's influenced by your personality, your temperament, your family of origin. There's so many factors that influence how we step into what's next.
And it's hard to see what's next when we're standing in our grief cycle, looking around, searching for solid ground. Because as human beings, it's a natural part of life to have our emotional state change frequently throughout the day. But with the grief process, we have waves of emotions that sometimes we don't even have words for, that it feels like they slam into us and throw us to the ground. And all of a sudden, we're on the ground in a heap, and we're really not even sure where that sense is coming from. One minute we're standing up doing dishes or doing laundry, and the next minute we're leaning on the cabinet, heaving in sobs because we just became overwhelmed with this wave of some tremendous, pick the emotion, name it, that just slammed into us like that invisible wall. It's not always right in front of us. Sometimes it seems to pop up out of nowhere. And navigating that in and of itself is a little crazy making.
Yeah. What do you do with that? I mean, one of the things that I've learned over time is I would even use the word essential is grief requires expression.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find expression for this experience that you're having? And, we lack connection with other people typically. Grievers tend to isolate because they're met with, these unhealthy messages about how to move forward. Even the language we use is just not helpful. When are you going to move on? How come you're not over it yet?
Right.
Those kinds of feelings that you were doing something wrong. So if we don't have people in our orbit, a partner or a good friend that can listen to us express all of this, it does tend to be internalized. And the other thing that I've discovered is that not every therapist understands grief. So it's really crucial that when you're seeking the connection with that person who is going to companion you or support you in your grief, that it's someone who understands grief. And there are ways to find that out, to find out if that's a niche that they understand. One of the things that I learned recently is that the predicting the outcome, how someone is going to, create that next chapter of their life isn't related to the circumstances of their loss. The success of their, creating and moving through this and experiencing grief is the support they get at the time and ongoing. And yet I would venture to guess that most of us don't even know where to turn in that moment.
Yeah.
It's just, you don't know who to call. It's something we so keep to ourselves that you wouldn't necessarily know who in your address book would be the person who would have the resource for you.
Right.
And so grievers tend to grieve alone. And then they do the things like keeping busy or, just thinking that time is going to heal, just time marching on. Time moving allows for perspective and allows for you to seek out maybe good supportive information, but time simply moving on does not heal.
No. And when you're stuck in a grief state, and I shouldn't have said stuck, that was an inappropriate word to choose, but when you're in your grief process, that's more appropriate. Sometimes time feels warped. I think anytime we're in an emotional state, we have a sense that time is either moving really, 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 really fast or slow like a sloth. And I'm never going to get through today or the next hour, or how do I make it through the night, more specifically for most of us, I think. It's really interesting when we say, oh, time heals all wounds, you'll feel better with time. You know what? Yeah, maybe, but again, unhelpful. And so many of those things, as you mentioned, that we may blurt out to someone who's experiencing a loss, are unhelpful. We don't know as a society, because of our programming, so to speak, how to support each other, how to be open to witnessing someone else's emotions or excruciating pain. Um, and I think maybe that's part of the reason that we tend to shy away, and our grievers end up grieving alone. It's just not something we do in our society.
The best advice I ever got related to grief was just show up, because so many people won't.
Yeah.
You know, we somehow think we have to come up with something profound to say, or, you know, do something in a very tangible way. But it really is that companioning, that sitting next to somebody and just saying, I'm so sorry.
Or even just sitting with them.
Yes.
Another presence in the space in and of itself can be comforting. You don't have to talk. You know, we talk about that with couples who've been together forever, friends who we've been close to for a long time. We always say, oh, well, you know, we can go months without really talking to each other, but then we reconnect and it's like nothing ever changed. Or husbands, wives, couples who've been together for an inordinate amount of time as we perceive it, communicate almost telepathically. You know, it's that look across the room and you can acknowledge, you can know what someone's thinking or feeling just by looking at them, because the connection is strong enough for that. So maybe we don't have to show up and say the right thing, or maybe we're afraid to say the wrong thing. As you said, just show up, that companionship.
But this is such a foreign experience for us. I mean, I think the statistic I read is that we experience some kind of something that we would perceive as a loss about every 9 years. You know, so think about when your first loss happened in your life, you know, when maybe the first grandparent died. I mean, we just don't have a lot of experience with it. And
Right.
that's why we rely on our conditioning, or we rely on these phrases that we've heard other people say.
Mhm.
And I think it's when we experience our own loss is when things change, and we like, oh, I get it. I understand now. I have a better understanding of what this feels like. So when I first got into this companioning work, I started out with the grief recovery method, which is reading and homework. There it is. There's the book.
Yay! I still
And
have mine.
it really is a door that people can walk through. We're used to reading something and reacting to it. And it's a very safe way for people to begin this grief exploration. And then when we really start to get into it, and we're talking about a relationship, typically somebody who meets with me has a particular relationship in mind, whether it's a death or a divorce, or, you know, some kind of relationship, something is happening in their life that's significant, is when I noticed a pattern that people would come to a particular session in this work and feel paralyzed, feel like, you use the word stuck, and I don't think it's a bad word, because they're just feeling like, I don't know how to move on from this point. I've now unearthed something so challenging emotionally, I can't even do my homework. So they would come to
I
sessions
remember that.
unprepared, you know.
Yeah.
And so I started noticing this pattern, and it really was my understanding that it was impacting them in a somatic way. It was impacting them physically. I would say it was engaging the stress response, fight, flight, freeze.
Sure.
It's like, I am now in this overwhelm that I can't handle related to this issue that I'm trying to bring to the surface. And that's when I became attracted to really whatever could address that physical aspect of grief. And I learned about emotional freedom techniques, or tapping.
Cool.
And it is hands down one of the best things I could teach a client, because it addresses that physical aspect when our brains are engaged in the most primitive part that's about survival, about protection.
Well, and I
And
love that you
and the
brought up.
studies show that, it brings that part of the brain back online so that you can um, be more clear, make better decisions, focus, problem solve. And it doesn't change the fact that you have something challenging in front of you, but you're bringing that whole mind body connection back into alignment so that you can kind of take that next best step.
And perhaps clearing the field enough to figure out what that next best step is. Our next step for right now, I got to run to commercial break, but I do want to come back and explore not just the EFT that you're speaking of, but I also want to talk a little bit about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, because you sent me some materials and her process or her information. I want to talk a little bit about that from the materials that you sent me, because I found something really interesting in there before that I hadn't been aware of, and I probably should have been. So we're going to run to a station break real quick. Grab your coffee refreshers, your fresh cups of water. We'll be right back.
If you're a fan of the paranormal world, then you'll love WLTK-DB Talk Radio. Talk shows bringing you the latest on everything paranormal, cryptozoological, metaphysical, true crime, psychic readings, and more. The truth is here and now on WLTK-DB Talk Radio at WLTK-DB.com.
And we are back. Thanks for hanging around with us through that quick break. And just a reminder to access replays for many of the shows here on WLTK-DB is, wow, the link, where you want to go to catch those replays is WLTK-DB.podbean.com. That'll give you access to the audio versions of a majority of the shows here on our network. And then we are listed on Podbean under Self-Care Show.podbean.com. You can also visit the website at WLTKDB.com for additional information, show links, etc. So, Lynne, I found this morning. It's from Story People, which I think is so much fun. I've been a fan of Story People for years, but I think it brings us to that conversation piece that we were talking about, is just showing up and being present for people. And I wanted to just print it out and use it today. It says, imagine a world where we listen to everyone's stories and learn we're not as different as we are the same. Mm-hmm. And I think what I liked the most about that is it draws the parallel in that we're all the same in that we have lost experiences, but we're only as different as the way we find or the way we each need to experience the grief surrounding that loss and finding our ways to move forward. You were talking about EFT tapping and having found it to be very helpful with your clients in bringing different portions of our process and our physiology back online to cope with what we're experiencing and to find new directions. We were talking about that right before we went on break. This is Lynne Staley talking with us today about lost experiences and grief right here on WLTK-DB.
Certainly tapping isn't the only way to kind of bring our bodies back, into alignment. They're breathing, acupressure, there's so many ways. But what I love about tapping is it can address things in the present moment. If something has happened right in front of you, you can tap on these acupressure points to calm the nervous system in that stressful moment right then. It can be used in anticipation. So for
Oh, yeah.
people who are processing grief and dealing with the aftermath, the consequences of something maybe that has changed so much, whether it's a death or a divorce or a family estrangement or a health diagnosis, job loss, in anticipation of something that they have to face, whether it's a doctor's visit or heading to the attorney's office, to calm your nervous system, really calm it down so that you can again have access to that part of the brain that you need when you're in these important
Mhm.
meetings. But I think the most potent way to use tapping, and this involves a bit of a commitment, is to use it on things that you've stored from the past. And
Yeah.
we've had this conversation, Deidre. The past is present. There are
Yes.
so many things that we store, and so much of it we don't even have access to because it's so in our conditioning and
Mhm.
stored in our subconscious, but it's really there as a self-protective mechanism. But it may not be helpful anymore.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I always pull out this beautiful this visual aid, because
I
this
remember
is what
that.
happens to all of us. We
Yeah.
have these things that we've stored from earlier in life because it's not typical for us to have grown-ups in our world who know how to help us reconcile these things as they happen.
Mhm.
So you have the death of a pet, or your family moves and you leave the only home you've ever known. So I'm holding up, for those of you who are listening, I'm holding up a chain link, and it's basically links in a chain, and loss is cumulative. And
Mhm.
so these chains link to each other. And by the time we reach midlife, all of these things that we've stored can absolutely weigh us down and tip us over. So I've now put this chain link around my neck, and it can tip us over. And we look at the most recent chain link in the chain and say,
Mhm.
"What? Why is that the thing that tipped me over?"
Yeah.
And so that's why using emotion code or emotional freedom techniques or tapping to address these things that we've stored from our past can literally lighten our load, just
Absolutely. I
move
love
in the
that.
world.
Love that you mentioned a couple other modalities in there. Pranic healing can work in the same fashion. Root cause therapy, we do the same thing. We drop back down into the event, and we ask our unconscious mind, is it before, during, or after birth? And that gets some really interesting thought processes working for clients. So I try to talk about that before we go into the meditative state, because if you're not one who believes in past lives or reincarnation, that phrasing can be very difficult. But it's interesting on a different level to talk about experiences we've had in our past life being brought forward on a soul level into this lifetime, attracting more of similar experiences so that we can then heal that wound and be done with that lesson. Different level, but still talking about epigenetics, the straw under the load of the final straw that broke the camel's back, or the back end of the chain link, as you were saying. If we don't go back into other experiences and heal that as part of our process, it makes it that much more difficult to heal the current events or the current issue or the current trigger. Um, and I think that the idea and the visual aid that you gave us with that chain link is fantastic, because it really does show us how things accumulate for us. So we may be working on this particular issue that has brought us a sense of grief, but if there are others in the past that we haven't been able to look at or process, then you're not just dealing with the current situation, it's the accumulation of all of that. And each event, I think, evokes a different sort of emotional process. It's grief is
And what
different for
has
everyone, but it can be different for each of us depending on the events.
and what I've noticed is, as people start to explore the links in their chain or these
Yeah.
stored experiences, that they'll actually reconcile more than one at
Mhm.
a time, because there's something about them being maybe on the same frequency, they're a
Yeah.
vibrational match, or it's been the same, the issue started very early, and maybe we've said, I'm not taking that risk again. And it's
Right.
created
Yeah.
all of these other circumstances as time has gone on. So you tug at that and pull on that thread and heal an aspect of it. It's amazing how it can lighten the load of and maybe take care of other experiences that you've stored because they're linked. And it's just fascinating to me how it really can shift how you move in the world. That's what healing is
Absolutely.
for me.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you said earlier, and I thought of it when you held up the story people saying, is that one of the things that can really get in our way is this comparison,
Yes.
believing that we are, that our experience is so different or doesn't compare.
Right.
I see it with people saying, oh, my loss doesn't even compare to hers, so I'm just going to keep it to myself.
Right.
And or the fact that we sort of there's a hierarchy of loss in our mind.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is, our stuff is our stuff.
Yeah.
And I know people who have had tremendously close relationships with a pet. It is the
Yeah.
relationship that has been all about unconditional love for them,
Right.
more so than any human. And yet they feel like they can't talk about that or express it because people don't have that understanding or that experience. So when it comes to losses, comparison is just not helpful.
No.
It is how we make sense of the world, but in this area, I just don't think it's useful. You get to look at whatever is going on for you.
Mm-hmm. We're all as individual as our own DNA. And I think that applies to exactly what you're saying. We all have loss experiences of different sizes and shapes and origin, but a loss is a loss. And we all need to be, I think, in our society, given permission on a level. And that's essentially what you do with your work. At least that's how it felt to me as a client. It's okay for me to feel however I feel at any given moment. And further, I had to learn that it's okay to actually experience that emotion, whatever that emotion is. Anger, denial, and now we're rolling into our friend Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who for so long in the field of Western psychology was the gold standard, right?
Well, I think it's typical.
The stages of grief being listed as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think to an extent, and even she comes to say later on, yeah, that was a framework, but it wasn't the framework. And it doesn't, on the surface, and I think the way it's been taught, it implies that we have a specific systematic process for going through grief. You have to be at this stage and then this stage and then that stage. And wow, those of us who've been through any sort of a grief or a loss experience and dealt with grief, especially after having worked with you, we understand that no, it's not linear. You can be emotional in anger in one moment and then be just totally stuck in depression the next, and then wake up the next day and be back in denial. So even she went back later. I think you had here, it was an excerpt from an article, Myth of Stages of Grief by John W. James and Russell Friedman, in which Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself rebuts them better than they could in their opening paragraph on grief and grieving. And the quote that you sent me is, the stages have evolved since their introduction, and they've been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They're responses to loss that many people have, but there's not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Our grief is as individual as our lives, and not everyone goes through all of them or goes through them in a prescribed order. And I think that speaks so loudly to exactly what you were trying to convey earlier in so many different ways and different aspects of our conversation so far today.
I think we're drawn to formulas. we really would like to know that if we go through these 5 stages, we could get to the other side. But this was actually discussions she had with people who were dying.
Yes,
and it morphed into, this formula for dealing with grief. And so it really wasn't meant to be a grief model. I think there's some benefit in looking at those, the 5 stages that, that got distilled from this. But there's so much more to it. And I think that can be so confining. Your upbringing was different than mine.
Mm-hmm.
Your personality, your temperament, your conditioning. There are so many aspects to this that are factors. And I think that is actually what gets in the way, because we want to know that there's a path out. Well, guess what? The path out is through what you're experiencing. And it really requires expression. It's important to look at whatever unfinished business there is.
Yes.
You bring up having an emotional vocabulary that's very atypical. Mm-hmm. Most people kind of do the mad, sad, glad, and so I think that's really something I would encourage people to do, especially if you're a parent of young children. Start using that expressive language. I feel frustrated. I feel sad. I feel disappointed. Whatever it is, because that emotional vocabulary is a skill.
Mm-hmm. It really is.
So I think that's a really crucial aspect to this, is how do I express what I'm feeling and what I'm going through? And then I think it's important to seek connection. Mm-hmm. That is really hard in grief, but we're wired for connection. So to find that person that will sit with us, to find an expert in the field who considers grief and loss and life transitions their niche, and I can help people with that. I love being a connector. I'm not a therapist, I'm a life coach, but I have a short list of people in the Chicago area who really understand grief. So they're not going to be promoting these unhealthy notions, which some therapists do. It's sort of like, well, give it time and make sure you take your mind off things. Those kinds of really unhealthy notions that keep us kind of stuck in the sadness and not knowing how to even take a next step. There are also some really great,
as you said, Lynne, people can reach out to you. What website do we want to give them?
So my website is life-after-loss.com. And if they want to write me a note, it's Lynne, Lynne, at life-after-loss.com. I have book lists. I have all kinds of great resources that I like to share with people.
I was trying to pop comments in there for us. Sorry.
No, that's fabulous.
I kind of checked out just a little bit. My apologies.
So one of the other things that I would really encourage people to explore is that there's a difference between being an intuitive griever and an instrumental griever. So to look up those terms in terms of grief, because I encounter people in a relationship, and I'm generalizing here. It's not always this clear cut, but a woman is more typically an intuitive griever, more in touch with feelings, needing to talk about it, the emotional response, the tears, and more of a physical reaction. An instrumental griever is somebody who is more inclined to want to fix something, is more future oriented. And I'm generalizing to say one tends to be male and one tends to be female, but I think it can be really helpful because I see so many couples who want, doesn't understand the other's process is going to be different. And so why aren't you showing emotion? It's like you don't care. And that's not it at all.
Right.
They may be going into their workshop and hammering away. There's going to be a unique response to it. And I think we do all of this comparing, like, am I doing this right? How do I get to the other side? I can't, so much of it is about self-protection.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think it's so useful to have a companion that can kind of give momentum to the process.
I think I know we've only scratched the surface of the conversation and the process. Again, it's as individual as each of us is. So those roles can be reversed too. Sometimes the woman can be the fixer and the man can be the emotional feeler. It just really depends on who we are as individual people. But learning to develop the emotional vocabulary so that we can speak through our process and communicate where we are in any given moment is so essential and so important. Finding companionship to help navigate. And sometimes that's hour by hour, day by day. It's so very different for everyone. There were a couple of other tips. You were suggesting that we look up the two words.
Yes, the instrumental versus intuitive griever.
Sorry.
But I want to get back to one of the things that I really think is essential is this idea of expression. And that can be all kinds of things.
Yes.
It can be, I do SoulCollage,
Mm-hmm.
which is using found images to create this 5 by 8 inch collage that can be very expressive. So another way to express grief. Ritual, I think it can be such a beautiful thing. And I have a candlelight ritual that I share. People use it during the holidays to remember someone. And it really becomes our responsibility to say the name, to give permission to other people that this is okay, even if it engenders an emotional reaction and the tears come. Tears are healthy and cleansing. And the more we model this, that's how we change our culture to make it more likely that someone is going to know how to show up for another person in grief.
Yeah, it really is okay to be at a family gathering of any kind or a group of friends who are sitting together who have a common loss and to say the name of the person who's passed away. Keep the memory alive. And just simply by mentioning a family member or a friend who's no longer able to be with the group in this plane triggers memories, triggers emotions, triggers feelings. And part of the healing is working those processes together, the companionship angle, especially, I think, you may disagree, and please do, but especially in those circumstances where we're with others who can relate through their own experience of this person or of the job loss or the relationship breakup or any of those other things, the move, the job change, whether it's chosen or not. Similar experiences can evoke similar emotions and similar responses, but maybe they're very different. And it may be in discussing not just the commonalities, but the differences, we're offering those with whom we're speaking to look at their response through a different lens and maybe find a different release in a different part of the pathway through the process, or simply the same pathway, but it can be walked together.
And that can feel just very supportive,
Yeah.
just, getting things up and out. I think it also, that expression allows, it makes room for something new. And not to be afraid of the fact that what's happening now is bringing up things from the past.
Yeah.
Because I think that's really where the power of, what loss teaches us, is to look at the things from our past that maybe also need healing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I come back to the grief recovery method. Even though I have added things to the mix, it's such a great foundation, because one of the very first assignments is creating a loss event inventory. So really being honest about all of the things in your past that feel like a loss to you.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's using that broad brush definition of, whatever has been disappointing. And it is so eye-opening to have that awareness. Oh my gosh, this is what has shaped me. This is what has, made me move forward in this way, or maybe allowed me to kind of shrink back and hold back, because you start to connect the dots. And then to really take a look at whatever relationship feels unfinished.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about this, the end of this relationship, either through estrangement, or, maybe the end of something romantic, or the death of someone? What didn't get said? What did get said that you regret? Those are all the kinds of things to bring to the light of day, to take a look at. And that's where the expression is so useful. And the grief recovery method, as you remember, involves writing a completion letter,
Mm-hmm.
which is to bring up all of those things, all the things that you wish have been different, that you wish had been better, the things that you apologize for, the things that you maybe need to ask forgiveness for, or forgive another for. I mean, it's really any, grief is about undelivered emotional communication. How can we do that? Is it through ritual? Is it through writing a letter? Is it by just, through regret, making a different choice going forward? I mean, there's just so much we learn from loss. And that's why I love companioning people, because I see it as a way to kind of clean some things up so that you can create the next chapter. It might be the one you didn't picture or plan for or want,
Right.
but there is still room for a joy-filled life.
It's so neat that you have given yourself the opportunity and the gift to others to walk this path, to walk through this process, and help them to navigate, because I know you certainly don't do the work for us, but to help people navigate this process. And it is a process, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's a dance. But when we get the opportunity, even in the smallest ways, through however we choose to work the process, but that's the important part, is to work the process in some respects, to put our feet back into, even if it's just a toe dip, into a moment of joy. And that toe dip becomes half a foot, or like stepping in the pool. You get your foot in, then you get your ankle in, and then your knee in. And yeah, sure, you may have to back out and cope with and process some other emotions at a different level, or that same emotion again at a different level. But then you can put your toes back in again. And each time it gets a little bit easier in some respects. So many layers to this work, Lynne. And I think it's such an amazing gift that you give to all of us, to have access to you and to others who have studied and done the work that you've done, to whom you freely refer others. Just to know that there are people who can, as you say, companion you through whichever part of the process you're in, or whichever part of the journey you're starting.
I love to link arms with people, and support them in any way that I can, and especially connecting them to good information.
Yes.
That is, useful and life affirming, because we're still here and there's room for all of it, the joy and the sadness.
It's amazing. We have the capacity for so much, and yet so often we force ourselves into a corner and find it difficult to get our way back out. And I really hope that by sharing this work, by opening doors to similar works that are valuable, that we can start to, and I know you have already started to work new systems, new ways, new understandings into our culture so that it can become easier for so many of us. Lynne, thank you so much for joining me again today. I know you're always out there in the audience listening, but it was such a treat to be able to bring you out front and give our listeners and our viewers an opportunity to get to know you and just really one aspect of the work that you do so much more personally.
Thanks for having me. And I really do encourage people to be in touch with questions, and I will share as many resources as I can.
In trying to pop over and put that link in the website to your website in the comments, I really fluffed it up. So if you wouldn't mind one more time giving us that link to your website so we can find you easily.
Sure. It's life-after-loss.com. And I also have a Facebook page.
Oh, awesome. What's easier?
Life After Loss Coach. So it's facebook.com/Life After Loss Coach. And that has no dashes or hyphens.
Awesome. Lynne, thank you again one more time for joining us today on Self-Care. What's Paranormal Got to Do with It on WLTK-DB? We're going to take one more quick break and then we'll come back and close out the show.
See you.
Ellie Weisensel's psychic medium is a medical intuitive that specializes as a body code practitioner. As an energy healer, Ellie offers additional services that allow her modalities to be intertwined with energetic healing. Within your subconscious lies information that knows everything about you and why you deal with specific conditions. The subconscious can be considered the blueprint to your entire body. With Ellie working physically with your subconscious mind, we detect what negative emotions are trapped and where they are stored within the body that is causing you your emotional and physical pain. This work is designed to remove imbalances and correct them energetically, getting to the root cause of why you have your condition, to help balance your body so it may heal itself. Your body is infinitely wise and wants to be in balance. The body code is not only gentle for humans, but it is also a gentle process to help animals. For more information, contact Ellie Weisensel at the website below.
Welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us. I know we're running just a few minutes late. You are still watching Self-Care. What's Paranormal Got to Do with It on WLTK-DB, and I'm your host, Deidre Sanford. We spent a lovely amount of time today chatting with Lynne Staley, who is Life After Loss coach. She also does SoulCollage work. She is an amazingly supportive companion through the grief process, and she has so many really neat things going on. She's just a fabulous person to work with. You've got her website, you've got her Facebook page. You can always find Lynne and connect to see what else she's up to. Later on this afternoon, WLTK-DB presents Kelly Brickle and the Psychic Hour at 3 p.m. Then Seeing Beyond with Kelly Eckhart and Cheryl Murphy at 6 p.m. We wrap up the day on WLTK-DB with Over the Target. She'll be back soon. We also have Chat with Charlie by Stephanie Lynn tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And we have an amazing new show called Tyson's Gift Podcast with Brandon Wainwright. I missed the episode. So I got to pop over and catch that show. That's one I really want to connect with. Thank you once again for joining us all today on self-care. What's paranormal got to do with it? Tim, Dawn, April, and especially Lynn, thank you so much for being here with us today. Sherry, we'll see you soon. Have a fantastic rest of the day, everybody. We'll catch up with you next week.
The truth is here and now on WLTK-DB Talk Radio at WLTK-DB.com.